Good morning. I'm Yevgenia Knezhevich. I am the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, one of 14 centers, part of Stanford Global Studies. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all back to Stanford this morning. We're really, really glad to see you all here. I wanted to welcome you to our annual EPIC Symposium, the title of which is Integrating Global Topics into Community College Curricula. And let me begin by thanking the team at SGS that made this program happen, particularly Kate Kuhns, Kristen Hara, Julie Tatsukawa, Simrith Matharu, and Stephanie Pichkevich. And I also want to thank our Faculty Director of Global Studies, Jisha Menon, John Groschwitz and Elizabeth Sands Ackerman, and the faculty directors of the Centers for Latin American Studies, Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies, and East Asian Studies who've worked hard to support the education program for internationalizing curriculum, which we all know is EPIC. So the EPIC program is a very special program, as you know, and it's something that SGS is especially proud of. It offers an opportunity to learn from and collaborate with you, our incredibly talented colleagues in the community college system, and who not only educate a vast number of students in this country, but also offer pathways to higher incomes for the country's younger generations and provide crucial channels of social mobility. The EPIC program brings together some of the key missions of the university: research, teaching, and community engagement. And it allows us to use these three cornerstone principles to make Stanford a more purposeful university. And we are delighted that every year we get to meet and partner with outstanding and innovative community college faculty and academic staff to think together and reimagine global teaching and learning as part of a community college curriculum. So to share a little bit about the EPIC program, it was founded with the support of the U.S. Department of Education Title VI funding, which continues to support it. And our mission is to advance outreach within K-14 institutions in support of area and international studies, professional development for educators, and curriculum development. And we've been fortunate in recent years to partner with the Global Educators Network, GEN, which was founded by EPIC alumni and is a growing professional network dedicated to empowering community college educators to develop and strengthen global studies across community colleges in California and beyond, and presents a really valuable opportunity for you to continue your year-long fellowship into the future. So in addition to our fellowship program, SGS has collaborated at Stanford with the Graduate School of Education's Center to Support Excellence in Teaching, or CSET, the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, CESTA, and the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, SPICE. And as you know, the flagship EPIC initiative is the Community College Faculty Fellowship, this competitive year-long program that each year brings together a cohort from various disciplines to work collaboratively with Stanford staff for an academic year on internationalizing core curriculum community colleges. We are also pleased this year to have launched the Community College Leadership Fellowship for senior administrators who are looking to build institutional capacity for global education at their community colleges that supports the important work that you all have been doing. And today, the symposium provides an opportunity for you to showcase the work that you've been doing all year and to discuss innovative strategies and tools for integrating global education into the community college experience. And so there's no one better that we could think of to lead today's session and to start us off than Professor Ron Abramitzky, whose research on immigration and income inequality gets to the heart of some of the questions that educators at community colleges grapple with daily, both in their curricula and classrooms. And so I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Ron Abramitzky is the Stanford Federal Credit Union Professor of Economics and also the Senior Associate Dean of the Social Sciences here at Stanford. His research in economic history and applied microeconomics with a focus on immigration and income inequality. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. He is the former co-editor of Explorations in Economic History, and his awards include the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship and grants from the National Science Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation. His first book, The Mystery of the Kibbutz, Egalitarian Principles in a Capitalist World, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2018, was awarded by the Economic History Association the Georgi Ranki Biennial Prize for an outstanding book on European economic history. His new book with Leah Bouston is up here on the screen, Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success, published by Public Affairs in 2022. And in addition to his research, he has received the economics departments and the Dean Awards for distinguished teaching. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker today.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here in this EPIC conference. What a great, you need to know how to choose names for this. This is wonderful. I love it. And I'm really delighted to share some of the findings today from Streets of Gold. This is a new book with my long-term collaborator and friend, Leah Bouston from Princeton. And the idea is to, the idea is to bring data and long-term perspective on the immigration debate, which is often based on fear and on anecdotes rather than on evidence and facts, as you all know. Much of the book is comparing today's immigrants to the immigrants you see here in this picture, just a few of the 30 million immigrants who arrived from Europe to the United States during the period of near open borders to European immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century. Of course, it's often referred to as an open border period, but we all know it was not really an open border period. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first act, the first law in the United States that excluded people from particular ethnic group from entering the United States, but it was open to European immigrants. The immigrants you see here from Europe entered the US through Ellis Island, mostly, or some other ports. None of them required a visa or a green card to enter the United States, nor did they need to prove that they have a job waiting for them or a family member waiting for them. They could just join. And we often hear this nostalgic view that European immigrants, this past Ellis Island generation European immigrants, assimilated very quickly into the US, and this is in contrast to immigrant groups today that are not even trying to assimilate and become Americans and make it into this country. This is where the phrase Streets of Gold came from. It was this shorthand to the idea that here is a country you can come here with nothing in your pocket and then quickly move from rags to riches. But of course we chose the title for a different reason. An Italian immigrant in the late 1900s said something like, I came to America because I was told that the streets there were paved with gold. But when I arrived, I found out three things. First, the streets were not paved with gold. Second, they were not paved at all. And third, I was the one expected to pave them. So we thought this captured beautifully what we are trying to do in this research that we do over the last 15 years. We build big new data sets to reassess some of the common myths about immigration and the American dream over the last 2 centuries. And so to kind of get a sense, and so, things like, I won't be able to talk to you about everything, but I'll just give you a little bit of a taste for this. So things like, is it really true that today we have a huge crisis on the border? There is an unprecedented flood of immigrants today. And is it really true that the Ellis Island generation rose very quickly from rags to riches, but immigrants today are not as successful? And is it really true that immigrant families end up being stuck as a permanent underclass in the United States? And is it really true that immigrants do not try even to become Americans these days? And is it really true that immigrants are committing more crime than the US born, and so on? To kind of get a sense of how we collected the data on immigrants in the past, you can think of us like the curious grandchildren searching for branches of their family trees, but then now multiply this millions of times over. So, here is one observation in our data. This is my own great uncles who came to the US from Eastern Europe in the early 1900s. We can follow my family across population censuses, right? Just like when you go to Ancestry.com, family search, you can go and you can look up your ancestors. And so the father Jacob here was listed in the first census when he arrived to the US as a junk driver. And then as a spotter a few years later, somebody who looked for imperfections in silk garments in the dry cleaning industry. Their son Lester eventually became a lawyer. The other son, Melvin, who literally adopted me and my family when we moved to the US ourselves, as I did my PhD at Northwestern, is now a medical doctor. And so we thought, if we could find our own family immigration story, and we can follow the immigrants and the children of immigrants and the grandchildren of immigrants, creating, like a genealogy of our own family, why can't we do it for 100 people? Why can't we do it for 1,000 people? Why can't we do it for all immigrants in the United States? And there are some funny stories there. One day I got back to my office, and the answering machine was blinking, and so it was like a very formal call from a lawyer of Ancestry.com. So I called them back, very worried, and they're like, "What's going on?" They're like, "You seem to have a very big family over there at Stanford. Like, what are you doing?" And I'm like, no, I'm just a social scientist trying to understand immigration patterns, But by the end of the conversation, he was really questioning me about whether Irish immigrants are as successful as the Italian immigrants. So I knew I was no longer in trouble. But for a while there, he got me worried. And the reason why we can do this is that census data, and by the way, I'll leave at least 15, 20 minutes for questions at the end. So I'm sure there are many people can relate to this topic and will have much to add. But census data becomes available to the public with all the identifying information 72 years after it is taken. So after 72 years in the United States, you can actually go and find everybody, including their right names, the names of their children, everything. That's how you can look up, for ancestors. And so the 1940 census data is now available, and the 1950 census is soon going to be available, and all the censuses going back to 1850. And that's kind of how we started to dig through websites like Ancestry.com that allow us to search for this. And we from that we scaled up the effort by creating algorithms that link these people and create genealogies of people over time. And we also, in addition to this data source, we also listened to thousands of immigrant interviews done in Ellis Island, and other places, and we read congressional speeches going back to the 1880s, and we used the latest linguistic models and tools and machine learning to systematically analyze these texts. And so with our data, we can reassess some of these common myths. And so, for example, my family story. So this is like my family, like the people I showed you, or the census manuscript. My family stories turns out to be quite representative of the patterns that we find in the big data. So the immigrant themselves never moved from rags to riches. There are heroic stories of immigrants moved from rags to riches. In fact, the part of the reason why we have these myths is because what stories people are likely to remember. It's the immigrant mass murderer and the immigrant who moved from rags to riches. And then, of course, families tend to exaggerate the story of their ancestors. Oh, they came only with $100. Well, they came with $20. Well, they came only with $1 and then they made it. They came with nothing. But rather than following the heroic stories, we follow the phone book. 30 million immigrants, and then you get a picture that is a bit more realistic. And the picture is that there is really no rags to riches, even not in this Ellis Island generation that is kind of credited for having these rags to riches stories. And immigrants, sometimes immigrants don't come in rags. Many immigrants come already with skills that allow them to find good jobs upon first arrival to the US. Other immigrants do come in rags, but many of them continue to work in manual jobs their entire life. However, the children of immigrants, this is where the heart of the story is. The children of immigrants are doing remarkably well, eventually, moving out of manual jobs and moving into the professions. And so, if you want the key takeaway from the whole book, and I'll show you a couple findings in more detail, is that the American dream means different things to different people. But the American dream, when it comes to here is a country where immigrants can come and then eventually their family is doing well and better than they used to do in their home country, is just as alive now as it was 100 years ago. But then again, immigration has never been a short story. It's more of a novel than it is a short story. So think about it as the novel has 3 parts. The first part, immigrants at least double their income by living often poorer home countries. And so, this is a global studies group. So I'll tell you, there is no policy that the World Bank can, or any country or organization can come up with that is as effective at lifting people out of poverty as allowing people to move across borders. Now, of course, if you take a US perspective, you start to think, is it good for the country, bad for the country, how is it affecting the locals? But if you take a global perspective, there is no better policy at allowing people, at lifting people out of poverty. And so as a result, both then and now, people at least double, oftentimes much more, their prospects relative to how they would do in their home countries. But then in the second part of the book, there is really no rags to riches, as I told you. It's more like immigrants make progress, but they don't move very quickly from rags to riches. But then the third chapter, the children of immigrants rise from almost every sending country, both today and in the past. And so I'll show you a couple of these findings. And I'll try to say maybe a couple words about why is it so hard to get to immigration reform and to get anything done in policy, given the story seems to be quite positive. But the first thing the first myth that is kind of like that is quite common is that we live in an unprecedented flood of immigration today. But this is really not true. So today there are about 45 million people in the US that are reported to be born in another country. So first generation immigrants, 45 million. About 1 in 7 residents in the US is an immigrant. So 14% of the population is foreign born. Is this the highest percentage of foreign born in the population ever? The answer is absolutely not. During the age of mass migration between 1850 and 1914, immigrants accounted for 14% of the population for 50 years. And then, of course, in the 20s, I'll give you a little bit of a crash course in American immigration history. In the 1920s, this period of open borders came to an end, starting with a literacy test for entry in 1917, followed by strict country-specific quotas that heavily favored immigrants from Western and Northern Europe over immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Then in the interwar period, we see very little migration, with some important exceptions, of course, individuals displaced by World War II, the Bracero program, and so on. but by and large, very little migration, and immigration remained low all the way to the 1960s, when immigrants accounted for about 5% of the US population. Then the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that came at the height of the civil rights movement basically abolished the quotas based on country of origin and instead increased immigration quotas substantially from about 150,000 back then to about today something like 675,000 visas per year. But of course, the demand for immigration is larger than the supply of visas, especially because no more than 7% of the immigration flow can come from any individual country. So this is not very binding for Liechtenstein and for Israel, but it is quite binding for China and India and Mexico. And so this gave rise to millions of undocumented immigrants, which is a concept that did not really exist in the past on a large scale because all immigrants were legally authorized to enter the United States. Where are immigrants coming from? If you looked at the US in the 1850s and 1860s, 90% of immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe, like the British Isles, Germany, Scandinavian countries, and so on. The remainder, 10%, were mostly from Canada. Then starting the 1890s, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe started to come in larger numbers, from Italy, from Russia, from Portugal, so that by the time the border closed in the 1920s, about 40% of the immigrant stock was from Southern and Eastern Europe. And today, of course, Europe is no longer an important big sending region of immigrants to the United States. In fact, many of you might know that it is a receiving region of immigrants. And 75% of immigrants come from Latin America, mainly Mexico, and from Asia. Now, the second thing I wanted to point out is that immigrant families are not stuck in a permanent underclass. They have never been stuck in a permanent underclass. So what we find is that the children of immigrants have always been incredibly upwardly mobile, even when they grow up in poverty. So for example, consider what happens when we compare children raised in families with similarly low earnings, okay? So let's focus today on children growing up at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, which roughly translates today to $31,000 per year. So think about this as two adults working full-time for minimum wage jobs, okay? And for the past, we use this census linking, the linking of the census, yes? So we can look at the parents, and then we can follow up the kids 30 years later, and now we have this father-son links, right? And the parents-children links. And for today, we use tax records linked to the census from the Opportunity Insight or the General Social Survey, which again allow us to look at parents-children links. And what we find in this apples-to-apples comparison is quite striking, I think. So the children of immigrants are able to move beyond the economic position of their parents more than the children of the US born. And this mobility advantage shows up in every historical period and from nearly every sending country. And it is particularly strong for the poorest families. And so here I can show you some of my work, but instead I thought I will show you, let me try to see if I can make this work. I can show you the New York Times one of the New York Times articles that they did on our work, and it was quite a humbling experience. They wanted to write a paper, they wanted to write about our findings, and they said that they want to visualize them. So we said, oh, this is terrific. We have some wonderful visualizations that we created. And they said, well, you academics, you should focus on analyzing the data. I don't know about your visual. We have a team of people who can visualize a bit better than you. And so we just gave them the data and the code. And here is what they came up with, which I have to say is quite beautiful, and actually awarded them quite a few awards in the in the space of creating visualizations from data. So it's quite nice. So here is our findings illustrated by the New York Times. So this figure represents people born between 1978 and 1983 who grew up poor in the bottom 20th percentile of the income distribution. Why do we focus on this cohort? It's because we need these children to be old enough to have career and income of their own. You know, I wouldn't want to follow a 17-year-old or a 20-year-old. I need them to be at least 40 for them to have an income that is like a representative of how they do. And what you see is the orange is the children of US born, and the green is children of children of immigrants. And you can see that as you scroll the article, these little people climb up from poverty into the low middle class and into the middle class. And you might notice that they bend their knees as they climb up those stairs. And then they move to the upper middle class, and then they kind of eventually become rich. Now you can see that by the time they reach their mid-30s or 40s, many of the children left poverty behind, whether they grew up in U.S. households or in immigrant households. But you can see that this is especially true for the children of immigrants. So here I thought I will show it because it's just one way of visualizing data in a way that appeal to younger people who can't care about your regression analysis, and it's quite nice. So, like immigrants are twice more likely to become, to move to upper middle class and to become rich than the children of the US born. So this is the highlight of my presentation. Everything else is downhill. Right. The only thing I didn't do is the highlight of my presentation. Okay. So, but of course you can ask yourself that this is looking at immigrants as a group. But what about, when I see these subtitles, by the way, I always hope that real people understand more of what I say than the computer here, it's like crazy. Okay, so this is all immigrants pulled together, but you can ask yourself, what about if you do this country by country? So let me show you a similar figure for immigrants from different countries, okay? And so the figure here shows how high in the income rank children growing up in poor families, yes, so the bottom 25th percentile of the income distribution, ended up reaching in adulthood. So, for example, you can see the US born, this is the purple point there. The US born children growing up at the 25th percentile of the income distribution ended up reaching the 45th percentile when they grew up. So every point on the figure represents immigrants from a different country for the 45 large countries around the world today. And the first striking takeaway is that as a group, the children of immigrants achieve more upward mobility than the children of the US born, reaching the 51st percentile on average. And just to tell you that the figure I show you here, we focus on the children of white US born. White US born parents in these charts, because the children of black parents tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. So the mobility advantage that we observe for the children of immigrants would be even larger if we included this group in the full population. We didn't want to because this mixed up many other issues, and we didn't want to appear as showing making the immigrants look too good by comparing them to groups that don't have much higher mobility. So we're like, okay, let's focus on white US born. The second notable takeaway from these charts is that the children of poor immigrants from nearly every sending country are more upwardly mobile than the children of the US born. Even children of parents from poor countries like Nigeria and Laos outperform the children of US born raised in similarly poor households. Even the children of immigrants from Central American countries like Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua, that are often demonized for contributing to the crisis at the southern border, move faster than the children of the US born, landing in the middle of the pack right next to children born in Canada. The one exception are children of immigrants from poor Caribbean countries here, Haiti, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. The children of poor immigrants from these countries are less mobile than the children of the US born, but what's striking is, and I didn't bring this picture unfortunately today, but the daughters of immigrants from those countries are doing very well. And so this, we conclude that this has more to do with race issues in the United States, because those are majority black countries, than it has to do with the immigration itself. The daughters from those countries are actually doing very, very well. We also, I can talk much more about these pictures, but I'll leave it at that. I'll say that the third finding is that the mobility advantage of the children of immigrants is just as strong today as it was in the past. So the children of poor immigrants from nearly every sending country were more upwardly mobile than the children of the US born in the past as well. I always find it striking that ironic that the one exception here is Norway, children of immigrants from Norway, because if you recall, one of the past presidents said something like, why do we get only immigrants from these, very poor countries? Why don't Norwegians come here more often? So when Norway was a very poor country, Norwegians did come here more often. In fact, Norway lost a quarter of its population to the United States during this period. And, they didn't do as well. It's only from the perspective of today, when you look at an immigrant group that is 100 years ago, that you kind of view them as an incredible success story. There is some room in 50 years where somebody will be presenting and they will show, and they will show how somebody will say, why don't Mexican immigrants come here more often? Why do we only have these new immigrants from country, X? So that's kind of something that I find interesting. And what's more is that some of the immigrant groups that politicians accused long ago of having little to contribute to the economy, like the Irish, the Italians, the Portuguese, they actually achieved among the highest rates of upward mobility. And the children of immigrants from Mexico and the Dominican Republic today are just as upwardly mobile as the children of Swedes and Danes were 100 years ago. And so that's kind of like one thing I wanted to show you. I can talk, just to tell me something. We have until what, 10:15 or 10? 10:15, right? When do we, 10:15? Yeah, good. So I'll speak for another 10 minutes or so, and then I'll open it up for.
I can yield my presentation.
Yeah, we can give up.
No. I really want to hear. So why you can ask yourself the question, why did the children of immigrants rise? Well, so now it's tempting to say, well, so far we were like, oh, everybody's saying immigrants are not doing well, and they're actually doing well. Now you start to see these pictures, and then you start to come up with heroic immigrant stories. Well, of course the immigrants are doing well. They are so amazing. They care more about their children's education. They care about everything. They are a bunch of such motivated, amazing people. Well, it might be part of the story. But we find a more mundane explanation that accounts for much of it, especially in the past, which is that has to do more with geography. And so that the children of immigrants, it is just that the immigrant parents tended to move to areas in the United States that offer upward mobility opportunities for everyone. And in the past, this mostly meant that immigrants did not settle much in the US South, which was a place that didn't offer much upward mobility. And instead, the US born are more rooted in place. And this is not very surprising when you think about it. We all know that, if you are born in a certain place in the US and your parents are from there, your grandparents are from there, all your friends are there, your networks are there, the food is so much better there. It's not that you just think about, can I earn a couple dollars more in another place? Moving to opportunity means moving away from home, right? And it's hard to move away from home. We all know that. But immigrants are a bunch that already moved away from home. So they may as well settle in a place that offers opportunities for them and their children. They are not as attached to a place. And as a striking proof that geography matters, and that it's not just about immigrant exceptionalism here, is that we find that the children of immigrants, they out-earn other in a broad national comparison, but it's not that they earn more than others who grew up in the same location. And so it is not that the children of immigrants in Palo Alto or in Providence or in New York are earning more than the US born in Palo Alto or in Providence and in New York. It is just that they are more likely to settle in Palo Alto and Providence in New York than the US born. In fact, US born who do end up moving within the United States, they look just like the immigrants. Okay? And so that's another thing. Then, you know, we don't want to be these boring economists just working on economic stuff. You know, that's not where much of the interesting stuff on immigration is going. In fact, you know, as we were presenting our research of how immigrants integrate into the labor market, we would often get this reaction that, those people opposed to immigrants, they don't really complain about immigrants not doing very well in the labor market. They compare that immigrants bring a culture that we don't love very much, they are different from us, and we don't want to change the culture in the United States, right? And so we wanted to test in the data, is it really true that immigrants today integrate more slowly into society than past immigrants that get all these, stories about how, Italians in the past, they didn't care about Italy, they wanted to become Americans, but immigrants today, all they care about is just retaining their own original identity and so on. And of course, measuring cultural assimilation is challenging because data on the many cultural practices, things like the food and the immigrants eat and the dress code and the accent are not systematically collected and can be hard to measure. And so what we do instead is we focus on other measures of social and cultural assimilation that are readily available in the data that we have, including data on learning English, including living immigrant neighborhoods, moving away from immigrant neighborhoods, marrying US-born spouses or spouses outside of their ethnic groups, adopting Americanized names to their children, things like that. And so here, this is of course the most cool measure here that we have. The one we like the most is the one on the names that the immigrant parents choose for their children as they, like in the United States. So, name is a cultural signal, identity signal. And so, but of course, but it's also it's available to both the rich and poor. So nobody will tell me how to name my child. So it's not so unlike, say, traditional measures of cultural assimilation. Say who you marry is both a choice, who you want to marry, but it's also a constraint. Who wants to marry you, right? But you can give your kid any name you want, and that's unconstrained by discrimination by the U.S. born and so on. Of course, we know that the fact that it doesn't cost money doesn't mean that it is completely cost-free, because if I named my kid Dallas, my mom from Israel will be on the phone and she will be like, where is the name Dallas coming from? How is that part of your cultural identity? And my siblings will perhaps make fun of me when I go visit Israel. And so, but that's exactly what we wanted to capture, this trade-off that immigrants perceive between wanting to assimilate to the broader society and culture, while at the same time caring about their identity. And this is just, I like the Kamala Harris picture because, it's Kamala and then Maya, right? My children, Roy, Ido, and Tom, So the Abramitzky family has finally assimilated in the United States by giving more American-sounding names to their children when they spend more years in the U.S., that kind of thing. So anyway, I will leave it like this, but but I'll just say that overall, any way we can measure it, what we find is that in the data is that both then and now, immigrants take active steps to embrace American culture, and at much the same pace today and in the past. This doesn't mean that immigrants completely give up their original cultural identity, absolutely not, but instead both the Ellis Island immigrants and today's immigrants preserve certain aspects of their cultural identities while at the same time integrating into American society. This happens quite quickly. It's not something that happens across generation. That is something that happens within a generation. I'll open it up for questions in a couple minutes, okay? Let me just wrap it up. I will leave at least 15, 20 minutes for questions, so that's good. Well, if it's so good, well, the story I'm telling you is so good, you know, America, the American dream is just as real now as it was 100 years ago. Everything is wonderful. The immigrants are terrific. Why has it been so hard to make progress on immigration reform in this country? And the short answer for this is polarization across political party. The good news, I guess, is that you know, there is an overwhelming, you know, in 2021 in a Gallup survey, 75% of Americans said that immigration is a good thing for this country. But we did some work that I'll show you now briefly, and I'll end there, that show you how there is an increased polarization in the perception of immigrants. So let me show you what I mean. So we have been collaborating with this, with amazing computational linguists here at Stanford to systematically analyze the language used in congressional speeches about immigration over the last 2 centuries. So our study used the full corpus of speeches from 1870 to the present. So that's about 8 million speeches in all, 200,000 of which are about immigration, okay? And our research team read through thousands of, a large sample of speeches and classified the speech as either positive, have a positive attitude towards immigrants, or negative attitudes towards immigrants, or just neutral attitudes towards immigrants. But of course, there are far too many congressional speeches for even a large team to you know, like to do in person, and so to read them all. And so we used machine learning to scale up the information from the human readers. And essentially, you can think about it, we help the computer learn from the sample of speeches coded by hand about which speech is positive or negative or neutral about immigration. And here is what we find. So in the past, we find consistently and highly negative attitudes and across parties all the way until 1950. So in the past, you'll be hard-pressed to find anybody saying anything good about immigrants. So when I hear today, oh, you know, the way Trump and Republicans speak about immigrants, we've never heard this before. In the past, it was only heard at the fringe society. Absolutely not true. Here is just an example. This is Senator Henry Cabot Lodge with a Harvard PhD in history, who was one of the architects of the Dillingham Commission report in the 1920s that put an end eventually to the first age of mass migration. And he's saying immigrants are from races most alien to the body of the American people and from the lowest and most illiterate classes of these races. It turns out that he's just an average speaker. You know, he's not like I didn't choose an outlier here, okay? Okay, that's, however, consistent and high, you know, the rapid transition to positive attitudes within one generation from 1945 to 1965 that persists until today. So, you know, red Republicans, blue Democrat, yeah? Attitudes towards immigrants in congressional speeches today, in fact, on average, is as the most positive that it has ever been in US history. But it is increasingly polarized by party, whereas Republicans today sound just as all politicians 100 years ago, and Democrats today are. We do much more than that, you know, that I can talk about. We look at what exactly are they speaking. So, you know, Republicans tend to mention things like crime and legality when they speak about immigrants. Democrats tend to mention family and contributions, you know, like when they speak about immigrants. We also look at dehumanizing language, you know, immigrants infest a flood of immigrants, things like that we can use, but I'll leave it at that. There's much more in the book. You know, here's my publisher always tells me to make a sale pitch at the end, you know. Refugees assimilate faster than economic immigrants. You know, we talk about, here I didn't mention much about, how, you know, is the success of immigrants, does it come at the expense of the US born? The answer, it largely, often does not, but I didn't talk about that today. We have also, this is a book with many, many, many individual stories of families that are quite touching, from oral histories in both Ellis Island and from a survey that we have done today, and so on. So I guess I'll leave you with this. The American dream for immigrants, at least, is just as real now as it was 100 years ago. The short-term view that politicians tend to take when they think about the next election cycle tend to undermine immigrant success. When you take a longer-term view, looking at immigrant groups who have been here for 100 years, or looking at the children of immigrants who entered recently, immigrants are doing very well. Catching up doesn't happen within a generation. There is no rags to riches. But it does by the second generation, and our research suggests, if nothing else, that different people can reach different conclusions for policy. I will be comfortable with that. I want them to talk about the same facts at least, and so if nothing else, our research suggests that it would be a mistake to determine immigration policy based on the belief that immigrants do not integrate into the U.S. economy and into the U.S. society, because any way we can measure it, they actually do. But I'll stop here, I think. So yeah, thank you. Questions and comments? Yes, please.
I'm curious, your second to last slide said something about refugees versus economic.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about the voluntary immigrants versus involuntary. So
Yeah.
you can think of involuntary, like those who were enslaved, for
Yes.
example, or even maybe those from the Caribbean. I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, so, this book does not talk about people who, came here involuntarily. There is plenty, in fact, my co-author has a whole book about that, and there is I can refer you to very many great researchers, but I didn't want to mix, we didn't want to mix these two. So when I say here refugees, let me tell you what we did. So in the if you go to Ellis Island, I don't know how many of you have been there, but if you haven't, it's incredible. And you can listen to in-depth interviews with immigrants, like half an hour-long interviews. This was done by the Ellis Island Foundations in the 70s and 80s, retrospective interviews with people who came to the country. The first half of the interview talks about, why did you come? How was it like there? Why did you decide to come? And then how was it like in the US and all of that? So when I listened to that, I'm like, how many of those do you have? They have 1,500 of those. So we took them, we transcribed them, we digitized them. And then what you get is, on the one hand, you know why they came. So some people came and they say, well, I came because I have a family there. Other people said, well, I came because I wanted to move I wanted to make more money. And some people say, I came because there was a revolution, I came because there was a pogrom, I came because I was persecuted, and that's why I came. And so we can tell from those, who was what we will call refugee today, and what we will call an economic immigrant. And because we hear them speaking, with linguistic tools, we can tell how good their English is. We can tell how good the vocabulary they use. We can tell how good their accent is. We can tell how the structures of the sentences. We can tell how good their English is. We can also link them to the census and see what their income is. And what we find is that those who came because of pogroms and persecutions and revolutions ended up having better English later in life and earned more. And this is consistent with the idea in economics that, economic immigrants, many of them end up going back to their country. So, in every immigration episode, about a third of people end up going back. Refugees oftentimes don't have anywhere to go back to. So they have all the incentives in the world to make it work in their new country. And so that's kind of, and this is about the past. Other work that is looking at more contemporary refugee episodes also find that refugees tend up doing well. So we kind of we wanted to make it as we shouldn't, anyway, that's the, sorry, that's the, yes. Did you, you want to have a, sorry. So yeah. You tell me who.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier part that the language of fear and overall this fear of immigrants of any kinds, refugees and immigrants. In your research, did you find out like what was really the result? I mean, what's the cause of this fear? If they are assimilating into the society, if they are, they have upward mobility.
Great question.
What's the fear?
Great question. The answer is it's not so much economics. So for example, I showed you this graph, right? This is just a kind of one takeaway graph. But we also delve deeper into what are they talking about. When they talk about economic issues, labor issues, Republicans and Democrats sound very similar. It's when they talk about more cultural stuff that they sound quite different. So the Republicans emphasize more that the illegality issues. Here is a country, we can decide our own immigration policy. Some people wait in line for all this time. Why should we let other people, just cross without documents? Or they mention immigrants are committing more crimes than, and they bring all their crime with them. Whereas the Democrats emphasize, this is a nation of immigrants, has always been. Many of the immigrants, even if they are undocumented, are working, contributing members of, and all that kind of stuff. I would say that we did one of the things that, because of so much conversation about crime, we decided to study after the book, in the book we had a little bit on this, but we decided to delve more deeply into the crime question. So in the population census, remember how I showed you there are families, here's the father, the mother, the kids. If you're in jail, you are in a correctional institution with another 200 people, and your occupation is listed as an inmate. And so now we can construct from the censuses all of the people incarcerated in the United States, going back to the 1870. And there is a question of where are you coming from? Are you US born, or which country you are coming from? So we put together this historical from 1870 to today incarceration of immigrants in the US born. And what we find is that, again, as a group, there has never been a period in US history where immigrants were more likely to be incarcerated than the US born. It's a bit more nuanced in the modern period when you focus on, for example, immigrants from Mexico. It is true that the immigrants from Mexico today, in the raw data, they are more likely to be incarcerated than the US born. But you realize that this is entirely driven by the fact that when you compare the entire US population to the Mexican immigrants are more likely to be high school dropouts and less educated. You're comparing them with the US-born scientists, they are more likely to be incarcerated. Once you control for education, the immigrants from Mexico, even today, are less likely to be incarcerated than similarly educated US-born. And so why that is something that is a bit, that doesn't feel like it's mostly economics and arguments about crowding out and things like this, but has more to do with what's your vision of how the United States should be like. Yes, you tell me, you're going to tell me who to do this.
Thank you so much for your presentation. A couple of questions. First of all, you're preaching to the choir. These are our students. As community college professionals, we know who these students are, and our students have gone on to Berkeley. In fact, one of our students went to Stanford last year and gave the commencement speech. The question I have is, first, what role does education have to play in this role of the upward mobility of the immigrant? Second of all, one of the problems is coming from Stockton, our students leave and they don't come back. These great immigrants leave and they don't come back. And third, I know you have a book to sell, but it would be great to get these PowerPoint slides so I can integrate into my American government class.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I would love to share. Yes, many of these people are your students. Here is where I'll be a little bit more pessimistic than I have been so far. The picture I show you, the one that shows you that the children of immigrants are so upwardly mobile. Let's think for a second who they are. They were growing up in the late 70s and the early 80s, right? These are children growing up there. if you remember, many of their parents, let's focus on the ones coming from, say, Mexico, Latin America, they are the ones whose parents were part of IRCA, where Reagan gave amnesty to the few million undocumented immigrants that were in the country then. As a result, the children grew up to these children grew up to citizens, grew up to American citizens or American permanent residents. And as a result, they did very well. If in 40 years somebody is looking at the children that are born today and see how upwardly mobile they are, I am not sure how good the picture will look for immigrants. And the reason is, unfortunately, completely man-made. Because if there are a few million people, a couple million people in this country who arrived to the United States before the age of 2, and the only country that they have ever known is the United States, but they have no path for now for citizenship or to become Americans. There are many more people who came later age, and their parents are undocumented. At some point, these kids often realize that, maybe some community college will accept us, maybe even Stanford will accept us, but what will I do with this education after I'm done if people are going to ask me to show that I'm legal here? And so you might very quickly realize that your returns to education might not be as high as you might think, and why bother? That's what I'm worried about a little bit. That, unfortunately, that is to me the something that, and again, this is not because they are any less motivated, it's just because the reality for them is that many of them live in a limbo for so many years. Still, I would say, of course, education plays a huge role in, to me, this whole project, the reason I did it was to say, you can imagine there have been people, this book got quite a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention from the left, got a lot of attention from the right. Some people interpret this book in a more conservative way. They say, well, great, the children of immigrants, of poor immigrants are doing well, but we also show that high-skilled immigrants are doing really well. They are starting up businesses, they are entrepreneurs, they are doing very well. So they're like, okay, according to this book, I'm speaking with my hand. According to this book, if you have only a limited number of visas you can give, why don't we give them to the high-skilled people that can create businesses, right? Other people say we shouldn't obsess so much about bringing here people with less skills because their children end up doing quite well. I'm okay with different people reaching different conclusions based on the same data. But what I don't want to see is they are bringing drugs, they are bringing crime, they are rape, and I want at least to be able for people to argue about the same underlying facts. So I don't have an amazing answer for you on, surely education have a huge role, but I'm also a bit worried about children growing up undocumented and going to school and see no path for success. And I will share the slides. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for the information, especially when you're talking about the children of the first generation immigration. Make me, like first generation immigrant, feel so excited. I see hope for my daughters. But I also have a question. Do you have any research, or does any of your data show why the second generation, they thrive so well? And because for us, many of us come from community colleges, and most of our students actually are first generation, immigrants. And we do a lot of programming, trying to reach out to bring the hope for this first generation immigrants. Do you have any recommendations or any research show that why it's successful with second generation that we can use to apply to our first generation?
Yeah. So, first I will be a little bit hesitant to say that the first generation is not successful. It's just that the first generation, when they come in poverty, they make sacrifices, You know, you often come without language skills. Maybe, you know, you actually had a profession back in your home country, but now you come, you don't speak the language. It takes time. You make choices that are based on, you know, like your kids eventually doing well, even if you take a little bit of this. So I would not say they are not successful. I would just say they are not as, you know, like as everyone. The other thing, notice that I'm showing you here only partial picture. So this is here. I focused on children who grow up in relative poverty. There are all these other immigrants who come here that are not poor at all. You know, they are in fact quite high skilled, and they are doing already, and then the immigrants themselves are doing very, very well in the labor market. You know, the Silicon Valley here is full of engineers from India and China and everywhere really that are doing quite well. I here focused on the ones who grow up. And again, you know, like I think that for that group, it had a lot to do with geography. You know, you can see that immigrants are less willing to go and to, you know, even group in a small apartment, not live the American dream house in some suburb, locating in like maybe a better school district that will allow them to, you know, like to thrive. They, you know. But again, today, just to say, much of this is, you know, the finding on geography. We could do a better job in the past, because in the past we have the underlying data of exactly what they did and where they live. Today, a lot of the data is more confidential, so we get it in a more aggregated way. So we cannot really test the role of education, for example, and the role of other things in immigrant success. So we need more research on today's immigrants, you know, like what's the role of education. It's also related to this gentleman's question from before. So, you know, like it's good question. A lot of geography, but there are other things as well. I also suspect that some of these immigrants that grew up in poverty, they have other immigrants from the same country that are actually not poor. So for example, look at who is doing especially well in this graph: immigrants from India, immigrants from China. These are immigrants who are, you know, like who have many very skilled from their own group. Perhaps their network was able to help them move up, you know, so yeah.
Thanks for pointing that out. That actually segues to my question,
Yes.
which is, what did you look at the immigration policy, kind of like who the United States likes to accept now, whereas before, you know, there were no limitations. But, you know, since the 1965 immigration quota, and then further on, like who gets the H1N1 visas, et cetera.
Yeah, we did. In fact, one of the things we do is, for example, make use of, so for example, take the refugee example I gave you. Many of the, you know, there are findings that refugees are doing well today, but people who are against that say, well, sure, we help them so much. Surely they will do well. But the refugees that I showed you in Ellis Island, nobody helped them very much. There was no governmental policy that helped them. So that kind of gives you a window to how refugees and economic immigrants do in a policy that is not, on the other hand, not excluding them, on the other hand, not helping them just by themselves. The other thing we did was we looked at the 1920 policies. You remember how I told you that the border heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe over immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe? And so this almost created almost like a little bit of a natural experiment for us. Let's look at two regions, two counties, you know, that have equal share of immigrants, say 14% of immigrants. But in one of them, it was mostly Germans. In the other one, it was mostly Italian. After the border closed, one of them, the ones with Italians, will see a huge decline in immigration, and the other one from Germans will not see a huge decline. Are they, you know, if you believe that the immigrants crowd out the US born, they take their jobs, they reduce their wages, is it the case that now when you see lower immigration, the US born are better off? So we took advantage of, you know, we studied some policies in that way, trying to get at a little bit more causal evidence, you know, like about the effects on immigration on natives and so on, yeah.
I see that you have a similar picture for daughters, and I was wondering if you could speak to some of the traditional gender divides here. For example, if you've looked at data for women coming from countries as opposed to their male counterparts coming from the same countries, and how that success plays out, especially in cases where the woman might be coming from a country where she would have less opportunity, and how does it play out here? How do the daughters, stories go?
Thank you for the question. For in my defense, the reason I show you here the sons rather than the daughters is because in the past, one thing I forgot to say, in the past when we do all this record linking, it's much easier to link men because women change their last name when they marry. And if our algorithms rely, we don't have social security number that we can link, so we link people based on their first name and last name. So women are more challenging to, we now have students that try to overcome that by combining this with marriage certificates and things like that, and maiden name, things like that. And so I wanted to compare like with like, so I show you. But in the modern period, we have no restrictions. We see social security numbers, so we can actually see, we have information for daughters. The picture for daughters are very similar. We see the daughters of immigrants from nearly every sending country are doing better than the daughters of the US born. And the one striking difference there is that the daughters of people from poor Caribbean countries actually are doing very well. They are not like the sons of immigrants from those countries, but the daughters, tell a similar picture. So we don't see, at least in this evidence of like daughters more struggling when they are immigrants relative to to sons. I would say that interestingly, we kind of expected a little bit that. People that are more liberals, will enjoy the findings of the book. But one of the things that kind of was the surprise, I guess, for good for us from this experience of the book, is that a lot of conservatives like the book, and the reason the reason why what they find interesting in the book is that many of them some of them perceive it as a little bit of an anti-woke book. In the sense that, if everything is terrible about America, and America is horrible, treating everybody terribly, how come immigrants are so successful? And here, and that is not a story that is true. This is not an immigration story that is true always and everywhere. Immigrants in Europe, children of immigrants in Europe, aren't doing as well. So there is some special sauce here in the U.S. that allow the immigrants to do so well. So, yeah.
Well, so yeah.